that's how you start to cobble together what your tactics are. And that's the final piece of it. So what are your tactics? You basically have 5 domains. You have all things that pertain to what you eat, all things that pertain to how you exercise and move, how you sleep, all the drugs, molecules, supplements, hormones that you could possibly take, and then all the, call it the bucket of things that you would do to manage emotional and mental health. So if you think about the greatest successes in medicine, our current medical system, what I call Medicine 2.0, Medicine 2.0 is remarkably successful in treating fast death. So when you think about trauma, when you think about a person who's, driving down the street, car hits another car and, they suffer a significant injury that 100 years ago would have killed them, we now have remarkable capacity to save lives in that situation. Infectious diseases, of course, would be the poster child for this. Up until 150 years ago, we stood no chance against most infections. And today, some of the most devastating bacteria barely, touch the surface. And by the way, viruses that once wiped out civilizations, we can now vaccinate against and all these things. We've effectively doubled human lifespan, going from about 40 to 80 years by treating fast death. So big win for Medicine 2.0. The problem is we haven't really made much progress against slow death. So slow death is what most people think of when they actually think of death now. When you think of cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, metabolic disease, those are slow deaths. Even when a person drops dead suddenly of a heart attack, right? A person who's been asymptomatic their whole life and drops dead suddenly of a heart attack, that disease was killing them for 30 years. So unfortunately, we just haven't made much progress there. And as I argue, that's where we have to make progress. That has to be the transition if we want to be serious about longevity. I don't think it's not a priority. I think we just have the wrong strategy. So if you have the wrong strategy, you will fail. And I would argue that we don't have the right strategy for addressing those problems. So it's not due to a lack of trying. I think we've been trying very hard to eradicate slow death. And I would argue that the fact that we've had such little success, given the enormous resources that have been put in, both financially and simply sheer effort, I think is proof positive that we need a different approach. Well, I think you have to start with the objective. So everything I talk about, I've always talked about this way, or at least for more than a decade, and I certainly have written the book through this lens, which is you go from objective to strategy to tactics. So we always want to start with the objective, and I do think it's worth being clear for any individual what their objective is. And I take a lot of time with patients going through this. So, when you go to your doctor, that's not a common question. What is your objective? And again, it's not the fault of the doctor. I think it's the fault of the system. The system isn't really set up to ask that question. The system is more set up to kind of play a bit of whack-a-mole. Is there a problem right now? Is there a symptom right now that I need to address? But if you're trying to play this sort of long game, you have to work backwards and say, okay, what do you want to be true at the end of your life? And the framework that I use for that is called the marginal decade. So the marginal decade is the last decade of your life. Everyone will have a marginal decade. And that's not a pleasant thought for many of us to think about, right? I don't love thinking about the fact that I'm going to have a marginal decade, but I will. Now, you never know the day you enter your marginal decade. But many people know when they are in it. And the question then becomes, what do you want to be true in that decade? So let's assume that fate will smile on you and, God forbid, you're not going to have some premature death. You're not going to die in a car accident next week or be stricken with cancer in, 10 years or something like that. So let's just assume your marginal decade is kind of the 9th to 10th decade of your life. What do you want to be true in that decade? So again, we could drill into this a lot further, but I think what would emerge, and by the way, this is a valuable exercise because I don't think a lot of people do this. But I think everybody needs to do this and needs to go really far down the rabbit hole. Everything you're saying is achievable, but is challenging. So you have to build up an enormous reserve in those capacities today to cope with and anticipate the inevitable decline that's going to come in all of those. So that's how you start. You start with the objective, you reverse engineer what the implication of each objective is. Then we have to think about what the strategy is, right? And this is where I think it's very complicated in this problem. I think this is the step that most people just skip altogether and go right to the tactics. So they say, okay, I hear you on objectives. Now tell me how to eat, how to exercise, how to sleep, etc. And I think you can't skip this bucket. And there's a reason that those like chapters in the book that are devoted to this. If you're asking questions that are straightforward, you don't really need a strategy. So if you said to me, Peter, my objective right now is not to get a sunburn, we don't need a major strategy. Like, it's relatively straight. We can go straight to tactics. You're going to avoid the sun altogether. If you need to be in the sun, you're going to wear long sleeves and a hat, and then you're going to wear sunscreen and blah, 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 blah. And it's pretty straightforward. But when you say my objective is to live 10 years longer than I otherwise would, well, I can't just jump to tactics. They're not obvious. So instead, I have to go through a whole bunch of indirect measures because I don't have what I really want, right? What I really want is I'd love to be able to rely on the gold standard, which is randomized controlled experiments that would give me the answer. But for reasons that are self-evident and obvious and not worth explaining, we don't have randomized controlled experiments that answer all the questions that pertain to taking a 35-year-old and setting him up to be the best 95-year-old. So we have to have an option B. And option B really rests on a whole bunch of other pillars of strategic insight. So one of those things is, what are the inferences we can make from observational data of long-lived, well-functioned humans? So looking at the centenarians, for example, who we very quickly figure out are genetically gifted. So their superpower was picking the right parents, but we can still learn a lot from them. We'll put that aside for a moment. The other thing we can look at is short-term human studies that don't cover the hard outcome, such as the full duration of your life, but cover certain things. So for example, there might be hard outcome studies that look at heart disease or stroke, or hard outcomes that look at performance and functional metrics such as strength, resilience, and things like that. We then look at animal literature, or non-human literature, I think to be more accurate, that looks at the full duration outcome. So I think we can look at some of those animal studies and get a pretty good sense of what's affecting lifespan and health span, but we have to be careful with it, like we do with everything, in that we want to be very thoughtful that we're not just sort of zeroing in on one model. So this is again where we look at things that favor lots of models. So, something that's consistent across mice and worms and flies and dogs is much more interesting than something that is only going to work in one mouse model in one person's lab. Then we want to look at mechanistic studies. So how can we understand, for example, the benefits of exercise when we look at the cellular level, when we understand them, when we look at proteomic, metabolomic changes of exercise, and what do those things tell us, as an example, about, say, exercise or sleep restriction or dietary restriction? And then the final tool that I think we look at in our strategy bucket is Mendelian randomization. So sometimes you actually let nature do the randomized controlled experiment for you. So Mendelian randomizations are very elegant types of studies where when you can find genes that are responsible for phenotypes of interest, you can ask the question, as nature shuffles those genes, do we establish causality by the outcome? That's how you start to cobble together what your tactics are. And that's the final piece of it. So what are your tactics? You basically have 5 domains. You have all things that pertain to what you eat, all things that pertain to how you exercise and move, how you sleep, all the drugs, molecules, supplements, hormones that you could possibly take, and then all the bucket of things that you would do to manage emotional and mental health. It's very tempting to just focus on your favorite thing. Like, there was a point in time where virtually all of my attention was focused on nutrition. Like, I really felt that nutrition was the alpha and the omega of this entire equation, and all you had to do was sort of eat a certain way and everything was going to work itself out. Obviously, the medical establishment is hyper-focused on the medicine side of this, as evidenced by the fact that's the only thing we learned in medical school and residency, right? It's not like anybody taught you how to administer exercise or nutrition. Even if you knew that those things mattered, you had no education in how to actually do anything about it. It would sort of be like an oncologist who knows chemotherapy is good, but doesn't know anything else, like doesn't know which chemotherapy or what dose or what schedule or what biomarkers to use to track the progress of the chemotherapy in the, in the tumor as it regresses.